Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and this is the Nothing Ear 2. So now I typically review, we can call it hi-fi audio products on this channel, but that doesn't mean that I'm above using a pair of AirPods. I love the AirPods, and in fact, I know a number of audiophiles that also love the AirPods, both for their convenience and even for their sound quality. But they're not cheap. They're like $250. And if I'm honest, the audio companies that I typically cover, I don't think have done a very good job at providing an alternative. Enter the Nothing Ear 2, which is the company's second in-ear TWS styled TWS, and it is promising kind of Apple-like design, Apple-like functionality, and hopefully Apple-like sound for $150. So not super cheap, but definitely a lot cheaper than AirPods. And there's a lot of hype behind this. And I was curious to find out, can Nothing do what the other audio companies frankly haven't been able to do, which is combine the functionality with good sound quality for an alternative to AirPods that's thankfully cheaper. And that's what we're going to find out today. So I've spent the past couple of weeks listening to and using the Nothing Ear 2 and trying to find out. I've got a couple of other competitors here that we'll bring in and we'll talk about how these things stack up exactly. But before we do that, just a quick shout out to Huanyi Tech, was the company that sent these to me. They're a seller on Amazon. Hadn't heard of them before, but shout out to them for sending these to me anyway. If you want to check out the Nothing Ear 2, I've got them linked in the description down below. But with that out of the way, let's dive to the table and start talking about the physical stuff, what comes inside the box. We'll talk about this case and the functionality, and then we'll get into talking about sound quality and comparisons with other TWS. So let's start with, okay, what's inside the box? It is a nice, simple, no frills box. I dig it. And what you get is pretty minimal, but that's about all you need, if I'm honest. You get a number of different tips in different sizes, of course, and these are very much looking like AirPods tips. There's going to be a little bit of a theme here in that these things look a lot like AirPods in a lot of ways. But they give you, small, mediums or pre-installed, and large tips. They also do include a charging cable, which is USB-C to USB-C on either side. And apart from that, well, there's nothing else in the box except for the earpieces and the carry case that they come in. So let's go ahead and dive in and talk about this thing. So the carry case, all right, let's start with this. Overall, I think this thing looks really cool and functionality is actually pretty decent, but it's not my ideal carrying case. But let's start with the good stuff though, right? The clear look I think is actually pretty nice. It's better than I expected. I know that these kind of get a lot of hype for their aesthetics, and clear plastic, if I'm honest, can like sometimes be a little bit cheap looking, but I think they actually did it really, really well. It's kind of a thick plastic. There's even some parts down here where the plastic is so thick it gives you kind of like that resin-like glass light bending effect, which I don't know, maybe I'm just a sucker for it, but I dig it. It's a nice quality plastic. I like that. I think you've also got nice quality hinges on this thing, which doesn't maybe seem like the most important thing, but when you're comparing these things to AirPods, which are really excellent build quality, it's good to see that the Nothing Ear 2 is honestly pretty good. It's got wireless charging built into here, which is awesome. And also wanted to point out that just removing and replacing the earpods or the nothings in here is really easy. A lot of cases just make it kind of a pain in the butt, honestly, to take these things out. And it's nice and easy to remove them here. Pretty obvious where the left one goes and where the right one goes. There's no goofy mix-ups and sides and stuff like that. So I dig that. But if I'm, being picky, and I said again, this isn't quite ideal, I do think the footprint on this case is a little bit large. It's just a little bit, I don't know, it's nice and slim. It's actually a little bit slimmer than some other cases, which I'll bring in a little bit when we do the comparisons. So it's fairly pocketable, but it's definitely larger than a pair of AirPods. So there is that. Let's talk about the earpieces now. Punch in on those things. And I think these are like the best part of the Nothing Ear build quality, and maybe even the best part of this IEM entirely is these things are honestly pretty fantastic. I think they look great. Well, for starters, right? I think it's just kind of like a nice subtle look. Again, they use clear plastic on there, which can be sort of a hit or a miss depending on implementation, but I think they did a good job here. They don't have any like ugly electronics or ugly wires or anything showing behind it. It's all just kind of sleek looking and handsome, in my opinion. Let's see. But yeah, I guess the main thing I wanted to talk about now is the fit, which is kind of the other important thing about these earpieces and why I like them. Obviously, it's not just the aesthetic, but it's how well these things fit into my ears. Let me take one out so I'm not double plugging myself. But it's basically like fitting an Apple AirPod. And if you aren't a fan of Apple AirPods fit, my guess is that you probably haven't worn them because they're just one of the best fitting TWS out there. And the reasons why is just they slide in nice and easy. And this little arm that you have down here, which you also have in the AirPods, actually kind of helps with the handling, right? I'm not fiddling with this thing that's stuck inside my ear. I get a little handle on it, and I think that also adds to the stability of this thing in my ear. And just generally, I think these things fit comfortably. They don't insert especially deep. If you're used to a deep fitting IM, these don't fit like that. They fit like AirPods, which is nice and shallow, nice and comfortable, and very, very stable. So yeah, generally pretty happy with the build on these things. Let's see, anything else I wanted to talk about that? Okay, I actually did want to mention too, that unlike a lot of other TWS IMs out there, the Nothings do not use tap controls. And I think that is a fantastic quality about these things. I hate touch sensitive controls on these TWS products, and the Nothing Ear 2 does not rely on touch sensitive controls. Instead, it's got, like AirPods, it's got like this clicking function where you squeeze the stem to initiate play pause or turn on and off the active noise canceling. And I can't understate how important it is for me when it comes to the usability of these products to not have really fiddly touch controls. And the Nothing Ear 2 does a really good job with that. Anything else worth talking about? I guess just briefly I'll mention that the touch control, or like the squeeze on here, is a little bit more sensitive than it is on the AirPods, so I did sometimes still get some accidental presses, but far and away I had fewer accidental presses on these than I do on things like Samsung Galaxy Buds, because again, they're not touch sensitive controls, and I think that is phenomenal. Okay, that is the physical stuff. Let's get into talking about the functionality on these things. And there's, some good stuff. I'm not going to have a lot to say about the battery life, to be honest, because they claim 36 hours of battery on the case charge, which is a lot, and 6 hours of listening on the buds, which is, again, a lot. It does come down to 4 hours claimed when you're using ANC, but I never use TWS for more than 4 hours at a time, or really anywhere near close to that. So I have not been able to push those battery numbers, those claims to the test. But I don't know. In my experience, in my testing, the battery life, I had zero issues with it. Generally. On the topic of ANC, which I mentioned lowers the battery life on these, there is active noise canceling built into these things, which is pretty cool. And it's more functional than it is on some budget TWS IMs, but it's not as good as what you will get on a pair of AirPods. And I think that the noise canceling is even not quite as good as you would get on something like the Samsung Galaxy Buds. It's not going to blow you away, but I did find that it was useful. It was useful and it was effective at tuning out my wife's K-dramas, which is what she was watching and I was listening to, or I was trying to push into the background when testing the ANC on these things. There is also a transparency mode, which I think is pretty awesome. That's the thing that, Apple, I don't want to say Apple pioneered because it was done before Apple ever got to it, but the Apple AirPods are kind of like one of the best implementations of transparency mode ever. And they've also got it in here. Again, you just like press and hold or long press on the stem to switch into transparency mode. It toggles over, no problem. And then you get a little bit more audio from the outside world piped in. And it sounds mostly natural. It was pretty good. I would say, again, it's not on the same level as Apple AirPods, but it is functional and useful is what I will say to that. And I don't know, I don't have any big complaints about the functionality there. Other functionality that you have here, just kind of built into the software on this thing, is that it does actually have the auto pause functionality. So if you're used to AirPods, or if you've ever used them, you're listening to music, you take an AirPod out of your ear to have a conversation or something like that, AirPods will pause your music, which is a nice functionality. And the Nothing Ears also do that, which I dig. The Bluetooth range on these I actually found pretty excellent. Now, I only really tested them on my MacBook, my M1 MacBook Air. but I was able to go all around the house. I went into the garage, and not even anything approaching a drop from the Bluetooth connectivity. So generally really impressed with that. But again, I will mention that the Bluetooth range on my MacBook seems particularly awesome. So it could have something to do with that. And then the last thing I will mention is that there is an app for this, and I'm not going to show you the full functionality of the app. In fact, that's a little bit blown out, but we'll deal with that for now. But there is an app that has a little bit of functionality. The main functionality, honestly, is just equalizer stuff. There are some preset EQs where you can personalize the sound based on how you want it. You can play around with kind of a 3-band equalizer, raise the treble, lower the treble, up the bass, etc., etc. And then there's also like a listening test that you can do that will ostensibly personalize the sound to your particular hearing. Some things that I'll say about that listening test. We'll get into what these things all sound like in a little bit when I get to talking about the sound. But that personalization test, I gotta be honest, I think it was a little bit of it feels a little bit gimmicky to me. For starters, the test itself feels, fairly legitimate. It's a lengthy listening test. It takes a while to get through. But when I got to the end of the test, when I listened to the sound difference, there was a noticeable difference, absolutely, between the stock sound and the personalized sound. But then I had my wife do the listening test, and we definitely do not have the same hearing. I hear things all the time that she doesn't hear. And the personalization that she got was almost exactly the same personalization that I got. So my suspicion about what they're doing with this personalization thing is that they've tuned it a certain way out of the box, which again, we'll get into talking about how that sound is. And then you do the personalization, which for me and my wife just made it quite a bit bassier. And again, the difference between my personalization and my wife's was pretty small. So my suspicion is that they've kind of like exaggerated the before and after effect by making it really bassy versus not so bassy. And then the actual differences that are due to personalization are pretty minor. So somewhat of a gimmick. I don't know. Maybe your mileage will vary if you have different experiences with it, but I wouldn't have a ton of hope for that particular feature. That said, that will lead us into talking about the sound quality in general on this IM. Let's punch in on that just so you can start using your imagination before you start talking about the sound. And like I typically do, I will start by describing the sound signature. Then I'll get into talking about what I like about the sound here and what I don't like about the sound before we get into the comparisons. So the sound signature here on the Nothing Ear 2, I would say, based on the frequency response, which you can see on squig.link, I've got that linked in the description down below. Based on the frequency response, I really do think that these IMs were tuned, inspired by Harman. All right, there's a lot in common with a Harman tune. It's got an elevated upper mid-range with an elevation in sort of the lower treble presence region. Check. It's got a scooped lower mid-range with a bass shelf that begins in the sub-bass frequencies. Check, check. Right. So those are kind of like, for me, the 3 hallmarks of a Harman tune. So not half bad, right? Wrong. We're getting a little bit into what I don't like about the sound on these things, but it feels kind of like a cartoon version of the Harman tuning, if I'm perfectly honest. The presence region elevation on this thing is about 5 to 10 dB more than it should be. I'm saying 5 dB if you're a Harman fan, 10 dB too much if you're not a big Harman fan, and I'm personally not a big Harman fan. So it's quite a bit of lower treble. The lower mid scoop, I would say, is about 4 dB more scooped than what you would get from Harman, which is already pretty thin. So if you can kind of start to get a sense for what this thing sounds like, if you're not familiar with Harman, I apologize. But Harman target frequency response is basically a good way to get nice clarity out of your sound and a lot of bass. And that's what they're going for here on this. But I think they went a little bit extreme with it. Again, the personalization that I did, it made it significantly bassier. So that lower mid-range scoop that I described with the personalization, it kind of erased that lower mid-range scoop, and it just made it more of a traditional V-shaped IM. And there are other EQ options, which again, I've got all graphed on squig.link. I'm personally a fan of just taking the manual 3-band EQ, taking the treble adjustment and moving it all the way down. You can move it down 6 notches, and that's where I think this thing probably sounds its best. Yeah, so what do I like about the sound here on the Nothing Ear 2? I appreciate that there was an attempt to do something different with the sound than just like a traditional V-shaped sound signature. There was an attempt to do something somewhat sophisticated and go with a research-backed frequency response in the Harman tuning. But that attempt is about as much credit as I can give them, if I'm honest. So that's going to lead us into talking about what do I not like about the sound on this IM, this TWS IM. And I gotta be honest, I think this is the worst sounding treble I have heard on an IM since the Hyphaman Bolt, which was like a $10 awful IM that was available on drop like 5 years ago. I never did any video coverage about it because it sounded so bad and it was just not worth anyone's time. And I think this thing might sound as bad as that. Yeah, it's been a while since I listened to it, but the treble in this is just absolutely awful. It's elevated, it's gritty, it's low resolution, and it's even rolled off a cliff, okay? So if you look at the upper treble, there basically is no upper treble to speak of. My hypothesis is that they were not really able, for whatever reasons, they weren't able to get that upper treble elevation to give these kind of that sparkliness and detail and micro contrast that you would want from your treble, and that they instead compensated by over boosting the lower treble, again, kind of like the presence region, which just results in a sound that sounds, my buddy Precog, he described it as kind of like sounding like laptop speakers that are clipping, and I kind of have to agree. I don't think this thing sounds very good. And that's like, okay, that's not quite, that's mostly in its stock form. If I take the EQ and completely tone down the treble, I can get it so that the treble is not a problem in the sense that it's not like fatiguing or sharp or, I don't know, just awful to hear, but it is leaving me with almost no treble because, again, like I mentioned, it's pretty rolled off in the upper treble, and I think they were trying to compensate it for that by having the really elevated lower treble. So when you reduce that, you get something that's listenable. I would say it's listenable with the treble all the way down, but it's not especially pleasant, if I'm perfectly honest. It is not a hi-fi audio experience, in my opinion. But let's talk about how it compares against a couple of other true wireless IMs, so that we're not just talking about stuff in a vacuum. And again, I don't want to come across as like a hi-fi snob or anything like that. These are all Bluetooth TWS IMs that you might want to consider as alternatives to the Nothing Ear 2, but we'll talk about how they compare in terms of form factor, functionality, and then finally in sound quality. I'm just going to rank them right off the bat. In terms of form factor, I still think the Apple AirPods are the best. This case is phenomenal. I was mentioning that this case is not the ideal. You can see that size-wise, it's not massively bigger than the AirPods, but it is thicker, it is longer, and it's not as pocketable, whereas these things are phenomenally pocketable. And then the earpieces themselves fit phenomenal as well, which is a good reason why that they, kind of bite off the design of these things. Next up, in terms of form factor, honestly, I'll give it to the Nothing Ear 2. I think that they have a comparable fit to the AirPods, which is fantastic. I think they have a great look. In fact, I think these things look even better than the AirPods. I dig the aesthetics on these things. The case is a little bit on the large side, so that's why it's not quite as good for me as the AirPods, but generally pretty happy with the form factor here. Next up, I would probably say, honestly, this is the Halo GT2. These were around a long time ago, a few years ago, for like 18 bucks. I don't even know. I think you can still find them somewhere, but I'm sure there's a newer version. But the Halo GT2, this is like budget, super budget TWS, 18 bucks. Form factor on these, actually not bad. The case, as you can see, is pretty small, pretty pocketable. Maybe not the best shape. It's a little bit on the tall side, but pretty good. And one of the things I like about these versus a lot of other budget TWS is they actually have a clicking physical button on them, which most of them don't. Again, that was a thing that I like both about these things, is that they've got that click functionality versus touch controls. Whereas here with the Samsung Galaxy Buds 2 Pro, these things are, I think, 150 bucks right now on Amazon. this would be at the bottom of my form factor scale, partially because the case is a little bit too tall. It's significantly taller than the case here on the Nothings. The footprint's a little bit smaller, which is nice, but I think the tallness plus it's got kind of like this matte grippy finish to it, makes it a little bit less pocketable. But really the big thing that bothers me about these things is going to be the earpieces themselves. And one, they are tap controls, which I just got done praising these other devices for not using tap controls. These are all tap physical controls, which just means as I'm taking these things in and out of the case, putting them on my ears, I always am toggling play pause multiple times, which I find infuriating and reason enough that I don't like using these, if I'm honest. So there is that. And then I think also just kind of like the fit of these things is fine. It's really pretty fiddly to get these things into my ear. Having the stems on the AirPods and the Nothing Ear 2 is a big advantage in my opinion. These things are also pretty fiddly, but because they don't have tap controls, it's not nearly the problem that these things are for me. So that would be my ranking. Again, in terms of form factor, I will rank them as such, from best to worst. And then next, let's talk about functionality. And I think, well, it's going to be almost exactly the same. I think the AirPods just have outstanding noise cancellation, really good Bluetooth connectivity, regardless of if you're using Android or iOS. If you're in the Apple ecosystem, these things are also phenomenal because you can bounce between multiple devices really easily, and just a lot really going for them. I don't know. I don't really have any complaints about the functionality here on Apple's AirPods Pro. The Nothing Ear 2, I'll say these things are next, right? They've got noise canceling. It's not on the same level as the AirPods, but it's pretty decent. And again, it's functional and it's useful, which is what's important to me. There's a lot of TWS out there that have ANC that's, I don't know, not that useful. I think what you got here is useful, even if it's not the best. Again, connectivity in with Bluetooth was pretty phenomenal. And I guess I didn't really mention this, but I like the controls. Apart from just having clicking controls versus touch controls, I like the way that they've implemented it. You click once to play pause, you press and hold to toggle between ANC and transparency mode, and that's what I need. I don't need a lot of complication with my tap controls. Next, in terms of functionality, I'll go ahead and give this one to, it would be silly for me to not give it to the Galaxy Buds. They've got good active noise canceling. Actually, I would say the noise canceling here is better than it is on these, but and maybe not even too far behind the AirPods, if I'm honest. But mostly the reason this thing is down here is going to come back to the tap controls, and just like, it's irritating. Enough that I've got it down here. And then finally, the Hey Loud GT2. There is no functionality in these things apart from Bluetooth music listening. These are bare bones as it gets. There's no app. These all have an app. There's no app here, but it's $20, so what do you expect? And now finally, let's talk about how these things rank in terms of sound quality. And I guess I kind of skipped over the pricing on these things, but just as a reminder, $250, $150, $150, and $20 or $18. So how do these things stack up in terms of sound quality? Well, to my preferences, the Apple AirPods are still my favorite. This is the original AirPods. I have spent some time listening to the AirPods Pro 2, which I think sound better than these. For the record, I don't have them here on the table because I haven't taken the plunge myself, but I do think the AirPods 2 sound better than these. But even of the ones that are on the table, these would probably still be my favorite in terms of sound. Honestly, in some ways I prefer the Galaxy Buds. These things sound a little bit more technical. These things are pretty inoffensive in their tuning, but they're very, very low on incisiveness and technical performance, whereas the Galaxy Buds 2 tonally are maybe a little bit less mid-range focus for me than the AirPods are. But you get better technical performance. So these kind of trade blows for me when it comes to sound quality. Now, you might be expecting which of these two sounds better. And you just got done hearing me say I don't like the way that these things sound. So how bad is it versus the $20 pair of TWS? The reason these things are on the table is that these things, in my opinion, sound way better than the Nothing Ear 2, okay? These things are surprisingly a very good sounding TWS. They've got good tuning, and the bass on them is a little bit on the slow side. These are not very high in resolution or anything like that. The technical performance on these things is, yeah, it's pretty mediocre, but the tuning is actually pretty good. It's a good amount of bass and a good amount of mid-range presence, and even a decent amount of treble extension, which brings us finally to the Nothing Ear 2, which I really don't have anything good to say about the way these things sound. So that is my review of the Nothing Ear 2. As an alternative to the Apple AirPods, I don't know. There's a lot of sacrifices here. And when it comes to like the functionality and the fit and stuff like that, that is something that these do, I think, better than any other true wireless IM out there, apart from the AirPods. And so being able to get that for $150 is kind of tempting. But the sound quality, I think, I don't know. These things do not sound good at all, in my opinion. And I mean, you can use the EQ to try and finesse them into a place where they sound decent for you. I got them to sound listenable by lowering the treble entirely. They became unengaging, but I would say useful for things like podcasts or watching YouTube videos or something like that. For music, I'm not a big fan of them. I don't know. Out of 5 stars, I gotta give it, I think, just 2. Like, they sound that bad. I'm gonna leave it with 2-star review, but if you want to check it out, if the functionality and the fit and stuff is more important to you, I do have them linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this video helpful, if you liked it, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review, unless you want to carry on the conversation, in which case, hang out for the live stream. This is live. We'll have a chat, or join me on Discord, which I've also got linked in the description. Until the next time, have a good week.